I want to go through some left-wing voices on Ukraine today. After the announcement of medium-range missile permissions so that the Ukrainians can use ATACMS, Storm Shadows, and otherwise inside of Russia, there have been some wacky takes online. And I've been quite worried because I already know that within the Republican Party, the momentum right now is against continued support for Ukraine, which I believe is undercutting leverage negotiations, which not only, I think, decreases the chance of negotiations succeeding, but also, if they do not succeed, could also increase the chance of aid being cut off altogether, which would not only be a disaster for the United States, but of course, first and foremost, a disaster for the Ukrainians. And so right now, on the left, or at least the mainstream left wing, I think it's kind of time to circle the wagon. It's time to make sure that Trump doesn't sell Ukraine downriver and allow the worst possible deal to fall upon them, where people don't get to return to their homes, the children stay kidnapped that they stole, and they are having to give up more land or demilitarize or listen to a bunch of demands that are going to make them less safe and could restart a war a few years down the line. Not to mention, of course, ignoring their sovereignty, basic humanity, etc. Any plan that has the Russians occupying or taking more land that they don't control, like Kherson right now, on its face should be rejected. And so, considering that we don't know how Trump's going to fall, or exactly how much Trump's going to stick out his neck to support Ukraine and make sure it looks like he got a good deal, the left needs to be vigilant. It needs to be active. It needs to think. It needs to be out there ready to call out the nonsense when they're ready to sell out a nation that gave up so much for nuclear nonproliferation. And I do not think that the online alternative left is ready. Let's go through a few examples. Let's start with Owen Jones. He is a British left-wing journalist. This is in reaction to President Biden's decision on medium to long-range missile permissions to be striking into Russia, American-provided missiles. A Sunday roast, binging on a box set with your partner on the sofa, dropping your kids off at sports class, snoozing through your alarm. The thing about civilization is it's easy to take for granted, and then in an instant, you're in an apocalyptic wasteland, craving death. I appreciate the lack of hyperbolic language. Ukraine has the right to self-defense against an unjust invasion, measured against wider risks. This was the official U.S. position until today. I think Ukraine firing long-range missiles into Russia will mean escalation and more death and no Ukrainian military victory. Okay, so there's a few things here. Number one, this language is not helpful. This language does not help anybody. It just scares people. And I don't like fear-mongering. That's the first thing. Second thing is, Ukraine has a right to self-defense against an unjust invasion measured against wider risks. This is true. This was official U.S. policy until today. Delusional. Delusional. The idea that all of a sudden the United States no longer cares about escalate. If that's the case, we need Marines outside of Pokrovsk yesterday. If that's the case, we need American Air Force pilots patrolling the skies around Kyiv, shooting down any incoming missiles headed towards children's hospitals. If that's no longer the position, there is so much more we could do, or the French could do. The French could man air defense teams in western Ukraine to protect not only civilian lives and the civilian infrastructure, but also defense production, which helps the Ukrainian resistance effort. We're not doing this. Why? Because direct conflict between Russian and Western troops is very scary, and that would be an escalation. Now, mind you, it's not that the Russians haven't earned it through getting another army to invade Ukraine, and now there's two countries invading Ukraine, but you could consider it an escalation. There are things that are being held back on that could help Ukraine because they are measuring it against the wider risks measured against the benefits. The idea that because we've approved Ukraine firing missiles that we provided them at the air bases and the ammunition depots and the military bases that are actively being used to invade Ukraine disregards any and all measurement against wider risks is delusional. And I think it's Owen Jones, widely speaking, talking out of his ass. Either he doesn't know about these other restrictions, either he doesn't know about continued possible escalations that the West could do, or he doesn't know about all the calculations as to what the Russians would use to determine whether to do a forceful response. What about the fact that if the Russians used a atomic weapon against the West or even against Ukraine, that they could very quickly lose the support of the Indians and the Chinese economically, undercutting their trade, undercutting their war effort, and undercutting Putin's regime. There's also the fact that Ukraine's quite close, and there is the possibility of spillover into Russia itself. There's also questions of maybe not the West backing off, but believing that they cannot back off in a situation like that. Because if the West backs off after an atomic weapon was used in Ukraine, or especially if an atomic weapon is used against the West, then the sentence that's being sent to every corner of the globe is, use an atomic weapon, no consequences. Use an atomic weapon, the West will not challenge you. And then a bunch of Timbot dictators who are thinking about their ethnic conflicts or their territorial conflicts with their neighbors are going to think, well, all I need to do is get an atomic weapon and I can use it in a invasion and annexation of another country's territory. What consequences will come my way? Very little, apparently. If anything, you could encourage the behavior. And because the West would not want to encourage the behavior or normalize it, they could come back with a forceful response. Strikes on the units that engaged with the atomic weapon. It could be strikes on Russian units engaged in combat and occupation in Ukraine. It could be maybe even a missile launch of our own into Russia, or possibly, and most scarily, an atomic response. And all of these things are certainly on the mind of Russian leadership when they are considering whether they're going to put all of their wealth and power at risk to pull the trigger. Especially when the Trump presidency is only 2 months away. And would you really want to risk it right now when you see the image of a light at the end of the tunnel? Doesn't mean there is one, but there could be. And if you have the option towards walking towards that light at the end of the tunnel or ending it all, I think most will pick option one. So, yes, no, I don't buy that it was the official U.S. position. The other thing, I think Ukraine firing long-range missiles into Russia will mean escalation and more death and no Ukrainian military victory. So, escalation and more death. I don't know what they mean by more death, as in, what will the Russians do in escalation? Because so far it was they launched a missile at Dnipro, which they've launched missiles at many times before. So when he says more death, I don't exactly know what he means. I just got back from Kherson. I don't think the long-range missile policy is going to have an impact on the human safari. So I don't know exactly what he means by more death. But this last piece, no Ukrainian military victory. I don't like this view of weapons as Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, where if we just give Ukraine this one capability, if we just give them F-16s, or we just give them Abrams, or if we just give them ATACMS, and then we give permission for ATACMS here, then that's going to tip the war in their favor, and then they're going to win. No. It's not how war works. It's not how conflict works. It's usually a diverse set of tools that a nation has at its disposal, and the more tools, more flexibility, and supply of said tools gives them more leverage, more power, and more possibility to pursue victory. No one weapon in and of itself is going to win any country, anywhere, a war. So the standard that Owen Jones is throwing out there is a standard that could be applied to any war, and it would come up short. No. Long-range strikes is not going to win Ukraine the war. It could allow them to hit ammunition depots. It could allow them to hit the air bases that are still operating, even though most have been pulled back because of how long this decision took to be made. It could hit the troop gatherings that the Russians are making in order to push back the Kursk incursion to try to destroy Ukraine's military leverage. It could mean many things. Not necessarily victory in and of itself, but it could mean one step closer to a pathway that could mean something resembling victory, or resembling, if not victory in and of itself outright, the best negotiating position for the Ukrainians. The Russians cannot have Kursk be occupied. The Ukrainians defending Kursk to try to get some of their land back, I think, is more than fair. And so I think the way that he's judging this is just not fair. Anyway, that's the first one. Let's go into the second. Ryan Grimm, who does follow me. Look at that, he follows me. You guys could also follow me at DylanBurnsLIVE. He is responding to this post about how Biden has authorized the use of the ATACMS mid to long range weapons for strikes into Russia. And it even says here, in response to North Korea's deployment of thousands of troops. Ryan Grimm responds, Biden using his last few brain cells to push us into World War III before he is booted out of office is scandalous. Okay, how do I put this in the most polite way as possible? Tug on your nuts, okay? Get over yourself, change your underwear, do whatever is necessary for you to get a hold of yourself. So, number one, here's my first question before we get into anything else. What should Biden have done in response to the North Korean troop deployments? There is a second country invading Ukraine. Do we do nothing? Do we just concede even more? Like, okay, fine, you've gotten too many countries. You can have as much of Ukraine as you want. We have to do something. There has to be some response, or that support could very well escalate. And not only could that support escalate, but this is the dilemma. On one hand, if you come to match someone else's escalation, that could be one more ring in the ladder up. On the other hand, if you don't match that escalation, then the Russians get a message that you're not willing to, and then will attain escalation dominance, escalating in an area that you're not willing to. Which is crazy, considering that in most of these areas, considering the munitions that we have at our disposal, we could get escalation dominance. But we have to do something in response, no? That's my first question. I understand, there needs to be a bigger emphasis on diplomacy in the world, but part of diplomacy is, sadly, it also means, force and matching escalation. And, what was it that Clausewitz said? War is an extension of politics by other means? If you just stand back and do nothing, the signal that is received is, oh, we should stop escalating on our side on the Kremlin. It's take the initiative. So that's the first thing. I just wanted to comment on the North Korea part. The World War III is just like fear-mongering. He's just gonna stumble us into World War III and then leave office. There is thought put into this. The Indians and the Chinese do not want a situation where atomic weapons can be reintroduced to the traditional battlefield when they've got the Pakistanis on the border, and vice versa. The Chinese do not want the North Koreans thinking that they can deploy atomic weapons to retake territorial historical clay, because they do not want to have a war with the United States over the Korean Peninsula, and they want to keep them on a leash, which the Russians are threatening to cut that leash through their policy in North Korea right now. There is, of course, just the disincentive of our response. We could escalate support for Ukraine if they were to do something like this in order to send a message about the use of atomic weapons. We could strike the people who deploy those atomic weapons directly. Sanctions, as crazy as it is, could escalate further. And if there's one way to slap some sense into the Western leaders that are still using Russia's shadow fleet that they need to stop, it would be something like that. And I'm only talking about a few countries here. There are many countries that have an incentive for the norm that we've developed ever since the Fat Man and Little Boy were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. This norm that we've developed against the use of these weapons in large-scale traditional warfare, a lot of countries benefit from it. And Russia would be isolated from a lot of countries if they were to deploy that weapon. And so considering the disincentives economically, the possible repercussions militarily, and the diplomatic isolation that could come with it, measured against the benefit that they would see, and they would have to really use a lot. They would have to use a lot of atomic weapons if they were to have enough of an impact to justify. So, I mean, not like one or two. They'd have to use dozens. They'd have to use dozens to have a real strategic impact or even larger regional tactical impact on the battlefield. McFiston, thank you so much for the Prime. I appreciate that. Thank you. 11 months. And so just being like, oh, he's going to push us into World War III here. It's just fear-mongering. We need people on the alternative left sphere to be talking to people in a realistic manner, or we're going to go to negotiations with our panties wet, terrified because we've pissed ourselves, and willing to give up everything because nobody wants to trade Baltimore and New York and Dallas and Austin and Los Angeles for Kyiv. Just like people talked about, how Europeans talked about, will the United States really trade Berlin for DC? Or what about Paris for DC if the Russians were to try something? We worked through the entirety of the Cold War to establish a norm where the Russians would not want to even attempt that. For the benefit of these countries.
5D2D Derek has donated $5. The disturbing thing about these takes is not the impact they'll have, but what they reveal about the state of the left. I feel like we're spiraling the drain.
It does feel a little bit like that. And remember, this is going to be the first crisis of the Trump administration. It's going to be the first foreign policy thing. And they don't want to have, an Afghanistan right off the bat when it comes to how the Afghanistan withdrawal affected Biden's popularity. But I think Trump would be much more willing to sell out the Ukrainians after so much sacrifice, which I think means something to them. And I think it should mean something to us. To sell them downriver, we need to circle the wagons. And I do not think Ryan Grimm or Owen Jones, or really the majority, and this is painful to say, the majority of alternative left content creators are ready to circle the wagon, either because they're not well informed enough to be able to, or they're fear-mongering like this. And imagine, out of all the moments Biden could have approved this was the safest moment of the entire administration. Because the way Ryan Grimm says it is like, oh my God, Biden, near dementia, as he's just going out of office, just presses the fire away button with no care in the world. As if there wasn't some thought put into this. But at what moment would it be safer, on top of every other disincentive that the Russians have, but to do it when they know 2 months away Trump is going to be in office? They know then there's an opportunity for deal making. Are you really going to blow up the world if that opportunity is down the pipe? Again, there was thought put into this, but he's making it sound like it was a completely thoughtless action that risked the world for nothing but neocon warmongers. And speaking of that type of framing, let's move over to Cenk Uygur, co-host of the Young Turks, which, the Young Turks has many great hits on Ukraine, including, what do you mean, Patriot missiles? Patriot missiles don't work. That was from Annick Sparian. Let me read you Cenk Uygur's message. And this got a ton of attention on Twitter. What the F is Biden doing authorizing Ukraine to use U.S. missiles inside Russia? Which side of the political spectrum is this on? The right hates it. The left hates it. Only establishment Democrats or Republicans, who are all neocons serving the donor class, like this. Also our allies, because most of Europe has been calling for this for about a year and a half, and the Ukrainians have been calling for it for forever. So they, our allies in the country that's getting bombed and having their people hunted, they care about it, but who cares about that? It's all about, well, does the people I like or not like it? He's not going to be president in 2 months. Who cares if it's popular? If it's the right decision, it's the right decision. If it's the wrong decision, it's the wrong decision. Lives are at stake. The president of the United States, when he faces a security crisis, should not be going where are the political wins? Every single time it is time to make decisions that can save lives or give our allies leverage when negotiating against a barbaric, inhumane occupation. I don't care if the neocons like it. I don't care if Dick Cheney likes it. I don't care if Henry Kissinger likes it in the grave. I don't care if the Lollipop Man or the Candy King or the Beetlejuice or who, I don't care who likes it. I do not care. It's either a good decision or it's a bad decision based on the tactical and strategic reality on the ground and based on the amount of risk that comes from making this decision. Biden's made the decision. I'm in Kiev. If there was going to be a nuke anywhere, here would be the first place. I'm not on fire. I'm not on fire. The Russians responded how? They responded by launching a missile at Dnipro. How many times have they launched missiles at Dnipro? Many, many times. Many, many times. Many, many times. Let's not just like appeal to popularity here. Because if that's the case, Chank, I guess you're in favor of the death penalty. Because, you know, the majority of people are, you know, against the, in favor of the death penalty. They think it's good. Punish the criminal. Guess you gotta, I don't care. Screw popularity. This is a question about lives. If it was unpopular to support Palestine, would Cenk Uygur say, well, you know, the left hates it, the right hates it, I guess we gotta drop it. It's only popular with the small academic class. No, because it's about principle. It's about principle, it's about staying with allies, about having a consistent foreign policy that doesn't just flow with the populist winds. What if in like a year, the Russians do something so horrific in Ukraine, again, like for example, running a human safari in Kherson, which they're already doing, that it creates such backlash that the majority of the American public and the majority of both the right and left say, respond, 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 bomb them. That wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change anything about whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. It would probably give us more leverage in negotiations if the American public was in favor of being aggressive against the Russians, and the majority of the American public is still in favor of either continuing aid to Ukraine or at least being aggressive against the Russians. That doesn't mean they don't want peace. People here want peace. People in Russia want peace. But peace with what? Peace with justice. Peace with justice. This is such bottom of the barrel, bottom shelf commentary. The left hates it. The right likes it. The right hates it. What? Who cares? Who cares? Who cares? If the neocons were like, I believe in the Constitution, and the left say, no, screw the Constitution because XYZ, and the right says, no, screw the Constitution because XYZ, I'd be with the neocons because I stand on principle and not based on who's my friends, on whether I like them, or they're my friend, or you know, I agree with them on most issues. It should be based on principle. It should be based on policy, not just looking for the political wins, Cenk. You're supposed to be there to say things that are unpopular. You're supposed to be there to say things that are, you know, unpopular, but the right thing to say. That's what the Young Turks was supposed to be about. It was about speaking truth to power and challenging the establishment. Are we now going to get Cenk Uygur in favor of the death penalty if we just do a poll and we find that 51% of the population is in favor of it? This is populism distilled to its worst parts.
I am so sick of this bottom of the barrel commentary. What happened to doing the right thing? Plus, you're cute.
Really threw me a curveball there. Really kind of threw me a curveball at the end of that one. Thank you for the $10. I appreciate it. My gosh, man. It's just... These are the people that are going to be online talking about the news as it comes in about the war. And we got 2 months. We got 2 months for these people to either, you know, have some sense knocked into them by an online pushback or, you know, come to some revelation, because the wagons need to be circled. The wagons need to be circled. Trump needs to know that if he sells out Ukraine, it will be a PR disaster for his administration. It'll hurt his brand. It'll hurt his administration. And it'll be starting off his admin with a foreign policy disaster. That is what he needs to feel. And if you're just like, only the neocons support, you know, strongly giving Ukraine the weapons it needs and the permissions it needs to defend its country. If that's your if that's when you decide to chime in on the war, is only to like tamper down support for Ukraine and not, you know, call out the human safari in Kherson, call out the largest mass graves produced in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides. I question your dedication to the population. I question your dedication to a peaceful and just outcome. The left is supposed to be about justice. The left is supposed to be about freedom, equality, fair representation in government. What is this? Bottom of the barrel commentary. The left is not ready. And unless they get checked by their own audiences, or they come to some miracle revelation because the clouds part and the rays of God shine down upon Chanking Gang, this is what we're going to get in January. We're going to get bottom shelf commentary from the Young Turks, Ryan Grimm, Owen Jones, and a host of other leftist content creators who have had 3 years to adjust their positions on the war, to reflect. And they failed. It'd be one thing for them to be against it, while not warning against the dangers of World War III and saying, well, you know, I want to support Ukraine, but, you know, I think that the relative risk to, on some level, I'd be like, okay. But when you go out there like, my family and my partner is going to be burnt to a crisp, I'm done taking you seriously. Obviously, you are not steely enough for this type of work. Oh, and of course, if you guys just thought it's online and only online, here's Rashida Tlaib retweeting Glenn Greenwald. Voters, I'm angry that we can't buy food, have no health insurance, our communities are crumbling, our neighbors are dying of overdose, we can't afford prescriptions, and we have no jobs that pay a living wage. The Biden administration. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announces every dollar that we have at our disposal will be pushed to Ukraine between now and January 20th, when Trump takes office. It's get that aid to them now, or potentially have the Ukrainians not get it at all. Because the Russians are doing everything they can to try to undercut support for Ukraine domestically in the United States. And who knows, they might have well succeeded. In fact, we delayed aid for like 6 months at a time. And that had an impact on the Battle of Avdiivka. People died. People died. Why would we want to stop that aid now at the most crucial point and at such an inflection point for the war, but also an inflection point for a diplomatic relationship with the Ukrainians? Why would she be complaining about this? Why? She voted for it. That's the thing that baffles me the most. She voted for this aid. She voted in favor of sending this aid to Ukraine. And now the Biden administration is like, oh my gosh, the situation's pretty dark. Let's get the aid over to Ukraine. And she's like, liberals, get out of here. Shallow commentary from people with shallow knowledge.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Dylan, do you have any good ways to reach out to mainstream media, lefty, populist, or MAGA to make them hear your opinion? Unfortunately, they don't follow your stream. Here's this. I hate to bring this up. The young anarchist variant said they would bring me on to talk about the war after I got footage in Ukraine. It's been 3 years. I don't think I'm getting a call.